So thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's event. My name's Victoria, I'm from the Bathurst Library. I'm really pleased to be able to kick off tonight's event and welcome you all as you join. You won't be hearing from me long because we do have some very special guests joining us tonight. But I'd like to first say thank you for registering and attending these online events. These days and ages, while these kind of events are very different to what we're used to, they allow us to continue to share our interests and our passions and remain connected. So thank you once again for supporting us and joining. As it is an online event, myself, Cassandra, and our In Conversation partner, Jenny, we're all coming together over different internet connections. So if your sound or audio drops out, please bear with us. It usually comes back in a few seconds. If all else fails, leave the meeting and rejoin, and it should be fine from there. But I will now hand over to Jenny Barry from our local bookstore, BooksPlus. Jenny is an extreme lover of all things literature, which we love. So welcome, Jenny, and I'll hand over to you to kick us off tonight.
Thanks so much, Tori, and hello everybody, and welcome. I'm really delighted to be here tonight to chat with Cassandra Pybus about her terrific book, Truganini, Journey Through the Apocalypse, which is published by Allen and Unwin, and which was recently shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards in the University of Queensland Non-Fiction Prize. I'm speaking to you tonight from Wiradjuri country, and I'd very much like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to emerging knowledge holders, and to acknowledge that sovereignty on the Wiradjuri nations was never ceded, and Wiradjuri country has and always will be Aboriginal land. And I'd like to welcome any First Nations people that are joining us in the chat tonight. Cassandra Pybus, for those that aren't familiar with her work, I'm sure there's not many of you that aren't, is a historian and independent scholar. She's published 12 books of non-fiction, both here and overseas, and she's undertaken numerous research professorships across her writing career. She's undertaken study at University of Sydney, Georgetown University in Washington, DC, at the University of Texas, and also at King's College in London. She lives in Tasmania, and I'd like to welcome her tonight. Hello, Cassandra.
Hi. It's good that I'm finally here and not sitting on the side of the road waiting for the man to change my tyre.
Yes, you poor thing. That must have been,
Anyway, it's done now.
Well done. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. And I know so many readers and listening in have already read your book, but for those that maybe haven't, Cassandra, this book details your very close connection, your colonial ancestors' connection to the country, traditional country of Truganini. And so in one sense, it's a very personal book, and in another sense, it's a very strong work in reclaiming the life of Truganini, so much we don't know. Can you tell us about those family connections and links to traditional country of Truganini?
I live in the traditional country of Truganini, which is, I live just across the D'Entrecasteaux Channel from Bruny Island, and my family basically lived for many generations on both sides of the channel and Bruny Island, and they were the largest landholders of freehold title of Truganini's country, the first people to be granted freehold title and the largest freehold title. So to that extent, I have a very powerful sense that I owe my kind of existence in this charmed paradise, as I see it, and many other people see it, to her. Now, that was not something I understood when I was a child. I heard the story of Truganini. Every Tasmanian child growing up heard the story of Truganini, but I didn't understand what my family's relationship to her was. It was, I knew that my family had once owned large swathes of Truganini, of Bruny Island, and I knew that they lived in this colonial cottage where I used to visit my great aunts. down at Oyster Cove. But what I didn't realise was that the land next door to that was the site of the Aboriginal station, and that the land that they had owned that I could see looking across the channel was Truganini's country. And once I did get to understand that, it was a revelation. It was in my mid-30s when I came back to live in Tasmania. And the greatest revelation of all was to read the journals of my ancestor's neighbour, George Augustus Robertson, who was the man who took Truganini away from Bruny Island and travelled with her for 13 years, rounding up all the other people he could find in Tasmania and taking them to Flinders Island, where they mostly died. It's a terrible story. It's a story of one of the worst colonial stories in modern history, if not the worst. It is the most clear-cut case of colonial genocide in the modern world, and that's my inheritance. This is a big issue to wrestle with. Yeah. But my way of dealing with that was I wrote a book about it when I first came back to Tasmania called Community of Thieves, which is really looking at what happened to the original people of Tasmania and how my family were implicated in that. But that didn't really satisfy me. And after years of waiting for a book about Truganini, I decided that I was driven to write it myself because it was my way of kind of showing that I would take some responsibility these generations later for the terrible things that had been done.
And like you said, the mythology, like you said, you growing up as a child in Tasmania were very aware of Truganini, but for many mainlanders, I think they, have been aware, but there was so much mythology about her, predominantly.
It was only the mythology that I was aware of, that there was this woman, Queen Truganini, she was often referred to, which was complete misnomer, who was the last of the Tasmanians. And the pictures that you would see of her, because she was much photographed and previous to that painted and sculpted, but the only photographs that you saw of her was her as a very old woman wearing, dressed up in Victorian kind of dresses and, as if she sort of belonged in Victorian society, as if she was part of Hobart. And there would be these kind of sentimental stories about her, about how she would be seen around the streets of Hobart and how everybody loved her. And it was just, sentimental fiction that just kind of blew up after she died and became of interest to people, because she was nearly 70. Up until that time, she'd been of no interest to anybody. Basically, the only person who paid any attention to her really was George Augustus Robertson, thank the Lord, because it meant that, in his very voluminous journals, I had a way into her life, a way of seeing her that was not available through these self-serving narratives that the people of Tasmania dished up once she was gone, and they had her on display in the museum, or rather her skeleton on display in the museum.
And that connection with George Augustus Robertson, prior to that, you say in the book that Truganini, she was born into the Nuanone people, but at that time the Nuanone people had already experienced so much dispossession by the time Truganini was born in the early 1800s. And how did that connection with George Augustus Robertson happen? And can you tell us more about him? You describe him as a self-styled missionary in one description.
Yes. Do you think I'm getting too dark? If suddenly twilight has descended in Tasmania, if you'll excuse me for a minute, I'm just going to get up and turn on a light.
Sure. And then everyone can really see the beautiful Dombrovskis.
Oh,
which graces the
That's right. There it is, yes, behind me. Now, I think I'll take my glasses off because this light's probably now going to bounce off my glasses, but you can see me better. That's right. That's better, isn't it?
That's it.
Okay, George Augustus Robertson, fascinating fellow. He was a builder. He was a poorly educated Cockney who'd come up through those evangelical branch of the Church of England that kind of that eventually turned into the Methodist Church, but that really operated amongst the poorer classes in London, and he was an evangelical Christian, as was the much more elite governor of the state, and he genuinely believed that he could bring these people to God, and that in doing so he would save them. And that he wanted to save them from the murderous intentions of the settlers as well. And so he was rare amongst the settler class in having a genuine appreciation of the original people and a genuine belief that they were humans just like we were, and that they had the same capacity, the same intelligence, and the same, that was an extraordinarily rare position. But he was not rare in that he had come to the colony to advance himself in the world, and that his primary purpose of being there was to climb the ladder, which is why nearly everybody was there. And so the terrible tragedy of George Augustus Robertson is that he came to see that the about to become extinct unique people of Tasmania that he loved and admired were his path to respectability, climbing the ladder. He got into the gentry class that way. Because, by the time he removed them all from Tasmania, the settlers were so, enamored of him that they just gave him lots of money and lots of land grants, and then he got another fancy appointment in Victoria where he had an even more disastrous reign as the protector of the Aborigines. But he's a fascinating character, and the trouble with it is he's so much there that it's very hard to pull your gaze away from him and not make him the center of your attention, because he, you can't help but wonder what on earth he was really believed, what he was really thinking. But in the early stages, his journal is very revealing about him, but it's also very revealing about he's fascinated by them. He isn't just fascinated about them as anthropological subjects. He's genuinely fond of them, genuinely attached to them. And so he writes about them, and they infuriate him as well. But so he writes about them to begin with for many years in a very direct and candid way. So you actually get to see these people in a real, as real living beings if you choose to look that way, and not just see it through his evangelical eyes.
Because he undertook an extraordinary trek, I call it trek journey, through the sort of breadth of Tasmania. In his
time they went round Tasmania 3 times, full circumnavigations of the island over a period of 12 years. And I don't know if anybody's seen the film The Nightingale, but if you want to get a sense of what it would have been like, that will give it to you. Just these are overpowering temperate rainforests that they walk through. And of course, without those Aboriginal people who were his special companions, was Truganini and her husband were ready, and a handful of others, he wouldn't have ever been able to do it. And so as long as he was out there in the bush, he was completely dependent upon them. And he, to all intents and purposes, short of taking off all his clothes and daubing himself in ochre, he pretty well became one of them. And so the message that he was giving them, of course, was that he was going to save them. But the message they were receiving from him was that he was going to become one of them, and they understood he was protecting them. And so that they sort of understood, and he led them to believe that they would be able to continue to maybe move around a lot, but they did that anyway. But they could continue to maintain their traditional life. I'd have to put up with a few sermons from him. And he would protect them. And that this was the negotiation that went on all the time. You know, this was the deal. This was the transaction, you know, that they would help him and they would find other people for him. And he would basically, and through all that period, they were able to live the life that, as close as was humanly possible in the situation that had happened in Tasmania, the life they had been living. I mean, most of the people they were related to were dead. Their clans were completely disbanded, but they were still alive and they were still living the way they understood it was human to live, the way they had been living for 40,000 years.
And that's what's extraordinary in reading your book, is that you get this incredibly vivid sense of that almost day-to-day lifestyle.
It's
and
the day-to-dayness of it. Yes.
Yes, and the sense of Truganini's world, and which was so dependent upon that daily search for food. And she was incredibly resilient and incredibly able to secure food sources for him, and in many occasions she actually did help save his life on a couple of times as well.
Maybe 3 times, but yes, certainly twice, definitely. She was an extraordinary swimmer. Everybody who had anything to do with her would comment about her capacity to swim and dive and stay underwater for long periods of time and things. But as they moved across, I don't know if anybody has ever been to the southwest coast of Tasmania, the wilderness, the current still wilderness, Southwest Track, which was what they originally walked, which was the original Aboriginal track. Incredibly difficult terrain, shocking weather. And they were able to do that because they knew how to kind of live off the land. And at first he kept pushing them to move and keep moving. And eventually they, you know, rebelled and said, we don't travel that way. That's not how we do it. And so he had to kind of just give himself over to their, the way they lived. And movement, getting somewhere, was completely subordinate to ceremony, which happened every night, and the business of hunting and gathering, which was a ceremony in itself. You know, this was a holistic life that lived off the land. And so he had to be part of that. I mean, he had, unlike the convicts who travelled with him in the rear of the party, who refused to eat this blackfella food, and so they ate sort of spoiled rations of salt beef and weevily flour instead of scallops and crayfish. They would despise these natives, and they despised Robertson because he slept with them at their camp at night. He danced with them at their corroborees. He basically learnt their languages, and he, to all intents and purposes, went native. And this is the most likable thing about him. But because he's done this, he's a quite trustworthy. Quite trustworthy. He's about as trustworthy as you'd possibly get from a Christian white man who's observing people who are living the way they've lived before the white men were ever dreamt of. But so those day-to-day accounts of getting the food and traveling over the landscape, and the way in which, as it got closer and closer to the end, when there were less and less people to find, the way in which they lead him round and round and round in circles just to stay out there, just not to have to reach the end point. And it's only when he says, right, I'm packing up, we're taking you all back, I'm going to take you back to the governor and let him deal with you, that suddenly the people that they've been tracking for the last 4 months appear out of the bush the very next day. So they've known all along where they were, and they've probably been in communication with them, but they've basically been just leading him on a dance. And he can't allow himself, he gets furious with them, and he kind of, there's this vague sense that they might be kind of leading him astray, but he can't allow himself to believe that these native people, these non-Christians, can have got the better of him. So instead he says they're just like children and they don't know what they're doing. And so you've got to discard all of that kind of stuff about the simple natives and see beneath what he's describing, which is a clever strategy of survival.
Yes, because at that time, Cassandra, the policy of extirpation, I'm mispronouncing, extirpation.
Extirpation.
Thank you. Was prevalent, and also during that time in the colony, it was under martial law. So there was an enormous.
If they hadn't have been with him, they would have been shot.
Yes.
But, and he kept telling them that, and he was so angry with them because they would take terrible risks to go and get some potatoes or flour and tea and sugar. They were addicted already to flour and tea and sugar. Highly addictive things, and so it's really not surprising that they were addicted to them. But they would take these risks to get close to settlers' homesteads and things when they got the opportunity, so they could, you know, get these things that they craved, because he knew that they, you know, they would be shot on sight, and he was basically on a couple of occasions able to intervene and make it clear that they were under the governor's protection, and that they'd be, if they got killed, they'd be, the people who killed them would be in trouble.
And you really detail that, the brutality of that policy in all its horror during that time in Tasmania.
Although, you know, that's not the real horror. The real horror is the kind of benign stupidity of it. You know, the idea that you can kind of come to a landscape that seems as if it's just been perfectly made to graze sheep on. It's actually been perfectly made to graze kangaroo on, deliberately so. And so God has just left this pastoral landscape there waiting for you, and then, you know, the governor gives it to you. My ancestor got close to 4,000 hectares of Tasmania in land grants. That's massive, yeah? And there are other people who got more, and unlike my impecunious family, managed to hold on to it and still live on it, on heritage listed properties in the Midlands, with vast tracts of beautiful, beautiful landscape that they own, that was given to them freehold title, taken off Aboriginal people. Now, the idea was that this was their property, right? They brought their property rights with them, and that if an Aboriginal family who was starving because the kangaroo had all been shot for their skins would come on and spear a sheep, you had every right to shoot them and to track them down to their camp and, you know, execute the men at least. That's what John Batman used to do. And so, I mean, Robertson was right that these people needed protection, but those kind of little forays weren't what really did for the Aboriginal people in Tasmania. It was the fact that they had no resistance to disease, and that they would be penned up in these incredibly unhealthy environments where they were not able to find their own food source, and they were given a highly salt-based diet, bad water, brackish water, salt rations, no medical help, no attempt to deal with the influenza when it would strike, and basically terrible neglect. And whilst the colonial elite sat around and waited for them to die, and they waited for them to die because they had come to the conclusion that they were worth more to them dead. Well, of course they were, because first of all they got their land, and now they wanted their bodies. It's bizarre and grotesque, but that's my conclusion. Yeah.
And that reality of, you know, for someone like Truganini who grew up on Yuanone land, on what we know as Bruny Island, you know, one of the most beautiful places on the planet, and, you know, ends up on Flinders Island, which, like, is God-forsaken country from all reports, and so difficult. Like you talk about the exposure to, you know, white disease, and also the lack of food source, their traditional food source. Must have been.
And also, once he got to Flinders Island, where he had his own uniform that he designed for himself and his title, the commandant. I mean, this is a kind of, you know, self-taught bricklayer from London. Suddenly got himself into a position that would never have been given to anybody, a tradesman. I mean, it would only have been given to, you know, the younger son of, you know, the gentry class. And so he then has to do the governor's bidding well and truly, and the governor wants them all to become good Christian serfs, basically, good Christian, farm labourers or something. And so then he won't let them have their ceremony anymore. I mean, the ceremonies that he has participated in for like 12 years, they're not allowed to do that anymore. They've got to wear European clothes. They can't have ochre on their bodies, you know, all of these. So it's like this iron fist comes down on them to destroy their cultural, their way of to destroy everything that makes them what they are. And so, and he understands that. He fully understands that he'll never turn them into Christians because he spent so much time with them. He knows that until he breaks that connection they have with their land and their culture, he won't get them to become Christians. And he can forgive himself for doing that, because once they're Christians, you know, they've got God to look up. God will look after them. Doesn't work.
He's like almost a betrayal. He's such a man of contradiction, isn't he?
Yes, he is. But he's better than most of them.
Yeah.
Better than most of them. I mean, the same could be said for George Arthur, who's the governor at that time, the original governor who, you know, was behind the Black Line and the martial law and stuff, is that he genuinely does believe that these are human beings worthy of having some kind of place in the world, preferably not on the island of Tasmania where they might get in the way of farmers, but some place in the world, which is more than a lot of other people on Tasmania thought, which the word extirpation that you used isn't a word that means to eradicate completely, to pull up by the roots, to destroy utterly. And it was used at the time in England to refer to eradicating vermin like rats and in Europe, wolves. And so you get the picture, right? These are not regarded as humans. These are not regarded as on the same scale of humanity. And so they are seen as unique because they are seen as some kind of link between Neanderthal men and humanity. And so once there's so few of them left, there's a sense that, you know, these extinct people are unique, and what makes them unique is their extinctness, rather like, you know, Neanderthal man. And, you know, you only have to read George Augustus Robinson's journals to see how clever and adaptable they were and how intelligent they were. And he understood that about them, but it didn't stop him from collecting their heads and taking them back to England with him, no?
And for Truganini and her kin that travelled with her, this incredible period of dispossession and accelerated change happened in such a short space of time.
If anybody hasn't read my book, they're going to get a terribly grim picture of it from what we've been saying, what I've been saying. My whole focus is on how she was living her life, right? And she was not alone in this. She had a number of companions who were traveling with him, particularly her first husband, Waradi. They were living a meaningful life. And my argument in this book is that she lived a meaningful life on her own terms for her whole life. She was a captive of the state in one regard, but she never became a kind of creature of the colonial world. She always kept her own sense of who she was. Always. I mean, it's quite interesting to see the interviews with the people who lived at Oyster Cove, who knew her well, who saw her a lot, because she lived down there for like 40 years. There's no sense at all that she's part of that community, or that she's part of the colonial world, or that, you know, she's still diving right into her old age. She's still climbing trees to get the possums and diving for the shellfish, and commandeering people with boats to take her over to a traditional country on Bruny Island. You know, what would be the place in colonial society for an Indigenous woman? What is the place for an Indigenous woman who survives in colonial society? There is only one place for her, and that went well into the 20th century, and that was as a servant, unpaid one at that, a slave. And yet she never was. She never, ever was. She never became anybody's servant, or she made them her servants. I mean, the woman whose house she was living in when she died, Mrs. Dandridge, was her servant, basically. Well, Mrs. Dandridge was paid by the state to look after her. And she was described as sleeping on the floor of her bedroom with her dogs. I say dogs, 3 or 4 of them, sleeping on the floor in front of the fire with her dogs in the year leading up to her death, in this quite fancy house in Hobart. Like, this is not a woman who has been colonized. It's not. And that's my point. You know, she nevertheless resisted colonization to her death. She never did become a creature of the colonial world. She was her own woman, always.
Yes, and that's what your book, as you were
saying. She's delightful and funny and inventive and resourceful. She's all of those things, and very sexual too, it would have to be said. Very, in many ways, an extraordinarily attractive woman.
Yeah, and a proud Aboriginal woman.
Very proud Aboriginal woman, absolutely. I mean, when you hear that, you know, commonplace now, you know, I'm old enough to remember when that wasn't a commonplace thing for Indigenous people to announce themselves. I'm a proud Aboriginal woman from wherever. Basically, she was the full embodiment of being a proud Aboriginal woman. And that's what I'm really trying to get at. But at the same time, you can't escape from the narrative that she's embedded in. The narrative that she survives is a shocking one. And it's one that we all have to look at with clear eyes and understand that Australia has an appalling colonial history.
And it's of such timeliness now, when there is such a call for all of us who are descended from colonial settlers to acknowledge that dreadful history, and to recognise and give that voice. And you note at the end of your book, Cassandra, about the importance of that, and also the importance of acknowledging the Uluru Statement from the heart.
Well, I think the thing is that all of us have to, not just people like me who's descended from early settlers, but people who are descended from the whole of the waves and waves and waves of non-Indigenous immigrants who've come here. And we have benefited from the stolen land. We've benefited from the institutional racism. We've benefited from the genocide. And so we have to kind of ask ourselves the question about, what do we owe the survivors? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think we have to struggle to find it. And we do need to listen when they tell us what they want.
Yeah.
And I would have thought, having read the Uluru Statement, they're not asking for very much. They're asking for truth-telling. Tell the truth about what happened here and give us a voice. make us feel that we have a right to live in our own country as the people who are the original people of this country. You know, we have a right to have a unique status in this country because we are the oldest living civilization on the planet. And this is our country.
Yeah. Cassandra, I'm seeing some questions.
Oh yeah, better.
So one of the ones, a few people have talked about reading your book, and one of the questions is wondering when the word extirpation became unfashionable.
Probably in the 20th century, probably by the end of the 19th century, you wouldn't come across it. I mean, the Tasmanian people, to all intents and purposes, were gone from the mainland of Tasmania by 1836. A small group of people came back to Oyster Cove in 1847, and by the late 1860s, all but a couple of women were dead. And so, as far as the population of Tasmania was concerned, they were long gone, long extirpated. The odd wolf that was still wandering around in 19th century Europe wasn't that much of a concern. And so you didn't really have the need to use that kind of language anymore. And so I think you probably would still have found it being used for other kind of animals that or vermin that might have been considered to be a problem, but it seems to have dropped out of the language by the end of the 19th century. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Okay. And another question from Lynn. Cassandra, have you ever read 6 Australian Battlefields, which was edited by Al Grasby?
I knew Al Grasby all those years ago.
Yeah.
No, I haven't read it. No, sorry. But I was aware of Al Grasby's position on. Al Grasby was a very progressive man.
Yes, I'm not familiar with this book either. So, Cassandra, I just wanted to mention that your book also contains some beautiful photographs and colour plates. You did mention about those older photographs of Truganini.
The beautiful paintings.
Yeah.
By Bock. Yes, they are very beautiful, and there's a whole series of copies of them, but the originals are in the British Museum, and to see the originals was just so wonderful. They're very beautiful, and he was a fine artist, and so you do have a real sense of what these people looked like and how beautiful they were and how proud they were, and likewise the sculptures of Truganini and her husband, which are everybody said at the time they looked exactly like them, and they're just wonderful, and so. I find it really disconcerting, and I could have a whole lecture on why it might be so, that the imagery that you see of the last Tasmanians is the worst kind of imagery all the time. It's these terrible photographs that were taken of them down at Oyster Cove when the Bishop of Tasmania and some other people sort of came down there, dressed them up in layers of clothing and lined them up against the walls and took their photographs. Because by then they would be already being seen as kind of having some kind of value as scientific objects, and people say, oh, they look so bereft, they look so despairing.
Yeah.
I actually think they looked pissed off, actually, and I know that they were, because whenever they knew that that the man who came to preach to them was coming, they would know, because they always had somebody lie down on the ground, and they would hear his horse coming about a mile away, and so they'd all run away, and so there'd be nobody there when he arrived to have give them a Sunday sermon. But the bishop came by sea and kind of, caught them before they could run away. And he wasn't interested in preaching to them. He just wanted to take their photograph. Now, I never use those photographs. I find them really distasteful. And also the photographs that were taken of her in her old age in Hobart by her gentleman callers, who were these kind of members of the Royal Society who used to call around and talk to her and take notes about language and, supposed her customs, and probably measure her up with their eyes because they intended to get her body, and they did. These are not genuine representations of a living people. These are kind of trophies. These are scientific trophies. I don't use those photographs, and I wish that they were not littering the internet. And the worst thing is that a photograph of one of the other women at Oyster Cove is the most prominent image of Truganini that you will see on the internet. It's on the Wikipedia page, and it keeps being constantly reproduced. And it's not even her. They couldn't even be bothered getting it right. Like one Aboriginal woman is the same as any other. Yeah, right. And I find that I have complained about it to Wikipedia, but I find that it's that kind of lack of respect, and the fact that these are the images that people want to, why does it make people feel better to think that these poor benighted people down at Oyster Cove, who are being bullied by into having their photograph taken against their will, are somehow, pitiful. And so we can feel pity for them. Well, they didn't want our pity, and they didn't need it. What they wanted was our respect and our help, and we didn't give it to them.
Cassandra, there's a question from Lisa, just asking whether you're able to talk more about your knowledge of the Black Line, which is something you do.
The Black Line?
Yeah, you speak about in the book.
It's just a ridiculous thing. Could never have worked. It was
unsuccessful as well.
Extremely unsuccessful. But it had this success. It had a success in one respect. They had these people meet, every able-bodied man in Tasmania, convict-free soldiers, all of them, marching to meet one another in this pincer motion from either side of the island to drive the Aboriginal people into the peninsula where Port Arthur was built. And from then they would be shipped off to somewhere else, got rid of, yeah? Now, of course, they didn't catch anybody. Well, they claimed to catch an old man and a boy, but actually they'd recruited them as guides. So they didn't actually catch anybody. But what they did do was make it very clear to the leadership of the remaining clans in Tasmania that the colonists were determined to get rid of them. And so when Robertson came along at the same time and said, I will keep you from these soldiers and these men who are marching, because I will protect you, I will give you the governor's kind of protection, they believed him. They threw their lot in with him because they could see that continuing to wage a kind of guerrilla war in Tasmania was only going to bring them more tragedy than they'd already experienced, and that he did promise them that they would be able to stay in Tasmania. I mean, he lied about what the deal would be, but it certainly made them amenable to his proposition in a way that they might not have otherwise been. So to that extent, I would think that it did have some success. It certainly hastened the clearing of Tasmania, which was what the whole intention of it was.
Yeah.
But for the military operation, it was a joke.
Yeah. Yeah. Cassandra, there's a question about wondering what you're currently working on, or
Well, it probably shows in the way in which I'm talking about this book. I'm currently working on a book that's called Morbid Possession, and it's about the people who stole the bodies. The gentlemen, the governors, the colonial secretaries, the, you know, elite of Hobart and Launceston, who basically dug up the bodies and traded their bones.
which is
I was so shocked. I was so shocked when I came across the evidence of this. And this is by the time I'd practically written my book. And I've been thinking about this and doing research on it for like 30 years. And I thought, if this shocks me, I think more people need to know about this.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm currently working. I was supposed to be working on it in London, but and Europe, but can't get there. So at the moment, I'm just doing what I can here. Yeah, but it's a companion to the Truganini book. So it's basically, I see it as a triptych, really, a three-part project. The first one is my first book, Community of Thieves. The second one is Truganini, and the third one will be this book, Morbid Possession. And then I'll be done with it. Hopefully.
Cassandra, apart from those, first person accounts that you've so brilliantly brought to life in Truganini, I imagine there's also a lot of online resources, and you're talking about your next book and not being able to be in London. Are there online resources that you can access or not? Trove here, yeah.
Newspapers, the colonial newspapers, fantastic. I discovered that they had the same one in New Zealand too, because one of the people I'm tracking goes to New Zealand. But otherwise, no, because, they didn't leave too much of a paper trail, these guys. Okay. They weren't all guys, by the way. One of the most prominent was Lady Jane Franklin. And she did leave a paper trail of kind, but it's been laundered, and I think a number of collections that I've looked at have clearly been laundered, by which I mean people later have come by and taken out this stuff because, or at the time they didn't commit it to paper, or they burnt it, or they didn't keep it because they knew what they were doing was immoral. They knew what they were doing was illegal, but they saw themselves as serving a higher purpose, and a bit like George Augustus Robertson, really, serving a higher purpose. In this case, the higher purpose wasn't God, it was science.
Yeah.
But actually, it was really about aggrandizing themselves. There they were living at the bottom of the world in this little godforsaken colony that nobody had ever heard of. And they could get, the banks and people like that in, the equivalent of banks in a later generation in London to pay attention to them and to give them fellowships in their prestigious scientific communities and stuff like that. So it gave them a huge amount of status to be able to send them bones of the extinct, unique people of Tasmania. Yeah.
Cassandra, I also wanted to ask you about the importance in Australia of literary journals. Like, one of the first excerpts from your work on Truganini was published in the Griffith Review in the novella.
Well, actually, the very first thing I wrote about this was published in Meanjin a very long time ago, when Clem Christensen who knew a lot about the Bass Strait Islands and the Flinders Island settlement, was the editor. But yes, literary magazine.
You have also been an editor of Island Journal in Tasmania. Like, just the importance of those avenues for giving support to your work.
They have been very important, but I think that they've had their day. I think that they're not viable any longer. I think that it's a form of communication that has moved onto blogging and other forms of digital communication.
You mean online?
Yeah. I mean, I have a couple of projects that I, been working on and off for years, and I've often thought about whether or not, I don't want to turn it into a book, but, where could I publish this? Where would I put this? And the answer is, don't know, really. I mean, Griffith Review is probably the best option that we have, and I think it's, a treasure. But everybody wants to publish in Griffith Review because it really is the only one that has got any kind of a readership. I mean, the thing is that you write in order to be read. You don't write in order to be published. It is a problem that people don't read literary magazines the way they used to. It's just not part of our culture. It should be, but it's not part of our culture anymore.
I'm sad to hear that. I'm obviously showing my age. I very much love reading literary journals and
yeah, but magazines cost a lot of money to produce.
Yes, they do. Yeah. And
I mean, I think something like Kill My Darlings is, going in the new direction. Yes.
Yeah. Cassandra, we might wrap up there tonight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing so much of this wonderful story. And I urge everybody listening in who has not yet read it to read this book, because like you say, you've given Truganini a place in a push to restore her place in our national psyche and for her recognition.
Yeah, and I think probably I've made too much of my current obsessions and not enough of what was then my obsession and what really dominates this book, which is my sense that this is a wonderful woman who needs to be celebrated, and that, her story is embedded in an apocalyptic tragedy, but her story is not a tragedy. Her story is a story of a life well lived under the circumstances.
Yes.
Which were unique, which were remarkable. There's probably nothing quite like it anywhere, as I said, in the modern world.
No, and reading your book, you think you understand something about what happened in Tasmania and something of Truganini, but thank you. I learnt so much that I did not know, and I'm very, very grateful, and I really hope, and I'm sure it is already, giving her a place that she is thoroughly deserving of.
Good.
So
well, I really enjoyed it, and I'm sorry that I was a bit discombobulated because of my flat tire when I started.
No, you weren't at all. It was you actually moved into being very relaxed very quickly. I was impressed.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Bathurst Library, for organising this wonderful.
Yes, thank you very much to the Bathurst Library.
Thank you all so much for joining, and fantastic talk, Cassandra. Looking forward to your next book.
Okay, for a while. I've got to get to London yet.